Hello, in this video I want to talk a little bit about Baudrillard and the way that it relates to space privatization topic. This has been an ongoing lecture series that I've been doing, trying to talk about the various arguments that Baudrillard has and its bearing on various types of argumentation that show up on the space privatization resolution. I really enjoyed doing this series because I definitely think that there are some unique ways in which, particularly in the context of space, a lot of the debates that we have about science and technology are really tied to the question of various types of imagination and fantasies that are cultivated through different types of symbols, science, media, images, etc. And I think that it's really interesting to kind of discover the way in which these relationships kind of play on each other in relationship to how we think about the development of space otherwise, and the way that it relates to the concept of whether or not space privatization is kind of good or bad writ large. I also think that if you haven't, it definitely would be good for you to go back and watch the intro to Baudrillard and space privatization, because it lays out what I think are some of the primary arguments that I'm kind of using to frame a lot of the conversations that we're having in these videos. And I think that's incredibly useful to use as a resource to kind of understand where we're going for this last bit of 4 videos, where we kind of talk about specifically what Baudrillard looks like on the negative versus critical affirmatives. I definitely think there will be a lot of critical affirmatives, whether from space communism to Afrofuturism to different ways of thinking about various types of other structural criticisms and their relationship to space, and the way in which we should kind of be thinking about space outside of really hyper individualistic terms. And so I think there are a lot of really good arguments that Baudrillard actually makes about the way in which these types of science fiction fantasies and the way that we kind of relate to futuristic notions of how we relate to the concept of space ultimately creates particular paradigms that kind of continue the kind of order in which the symbolic order and the way in which signs and symbols are kind of passed around in a particular way that produce the same structure of violence that a lot of these critiques are trying to get to the kind of ends of. And so I think there are a lot of really good, interesting arguments to make about the place that the academy has, and other arguments in terms of what the kind of role that the type of dialogue that we're having in debate has towards the overall just kind of relationship that these various economies kind of draw up in relationship to what our imaginations are supposed to be producing. I think that if I'm kind of first just starting off thinking about what are some of the best forms of Baudrillard versus K teams, I think that the first thing I would say is that it's really important to have a flexible way of reading this literature based in the context of this resolution. I think that having arguments that stem both from some of the arguments that Baudrillard is making and the way that people have interpreted Baudrillard's arguments in terms of the academy are particularly important. Thinking about the ways in which the academy has kind of become a tool for hypercommodification and the kind of ability to kind of circulate images that only reinstantiate various sources of capitalism and privatized sources, but also making arguments about just the way in which various types of affirmatives try to think about a particular orientation to the future, kind of only slip into being able to be resolve the kind of content errors in the context of how we think about space, but not really the form of why things like resource extraction and all these other kind of frames of what we think about the world broadly in relationship to space kind of has in terms of how we've gotten to this point, and what kind of creates and recirculates harmful imagery in the context of these debates about space. I think that it's really important for you to kind of have a really clear basis of what you want to do in terms of devaluing or creating a certain value to the way in which these affirmers are really thinking about the context of why debate matters and what it does. I even think that you can make a little bit of a kind of slippage here where you're able to kind of concede some of the arguments that they would normally make about how future is key to the practices that we make on the everyday. And I think there are a lot of arguments that you could then make about why the way in which you're thinking about futurism as tied to the world that we currently live in would require a reinvestment in forms of resource extraction, capital commodification, etc., because those kind of structural factors still persevere as they attempt to kind of basically find ways to encapsulate and consume various alternative and radical visions of ways that we should kind of think about the world and space general. I think that this is really interesting in the context of how you start to think about maybe some of the framing portions of the debate. I think in the context of what you should be doing in the framing portion of the debate, a lot of the arguments that I think you want to make are about why the 1AC should be thought of as a particular archival process that you can kind of pick apart. I feel like a lot of the 1ACs that will be offered on this are kind of different forms of kind of narrative storytelling or other arguments about how the future can kind of be reinvented. And I think that at a crux you can think about these as kind of science fiction fantasies that show up as artifacts within the academy, not so much as because you're literally standing in the academy, but because of the academic form they take up and the way in which they kind of use citation in order to make these futures kind of possible and more realizable, and make arguments about why that's the basis for where the criticism comes from. The reason why I think this is important is because if you're able to kind of move towards this more artifacting way of thinking about the 1AC, then I think that you have a lot of good arguments to make about why you don't really need to win, that there's a alternative material strategy for the ones that are created from the 1AC, but rather that you can kind of just send them back to the drawing board on the way that they are kind of framing the debate and thinking about the terms for what should be the the kind of like metric for how we're able to actually break out of like systems of violence as fundamentally different, and not so much a question of like whether or not the kind of future that they're able to make is able to make kind of these like daily survival practices, but rather why the kind of like artifacting in the 1AC allows us to understand at a base level why the way it conceptualizes what the kind of ability to kind of tell these stories does in the context of the world is misdirected, and thus why its energy kind of moves towards a place where it actually reinstantiates these same systems of violence instead of like disembarking from them. And I think making arguments about why, emphasizing on how those studies are valuable and invaluable, and building net beneficial in those places can give you a lot of reasons why the competition that you really want to be able to think off of is like beneficial not only for you, but the way that the judge is then framing the ballot. I then think that when you transition some of this advice into what you should be doing in terms of the thesis portion of the debate, a lot of the advice that I would give in the thesis portion of the debate is really setting out the reason why it's not just a question of whether or not like other institutions and etc. are able to just like simply commodify the context of the 1AC, but rather making arguments about like how, particularly in the like context of space, the way in which particular fictions have been passed is that even at their most radical, they have been reformatted in order to produce this idea of this kind of like unified public that is able to ascend into space, but that is only able to be activated through forces of like radical privatization, resource extraction, and other modes that are meant to continue forces of like extraction and violence on other surfaces. This means that things like various forms of affirmatives that think of themselves as various types of radical futurisms that are outside of like being able to be part of these structures because they detest them at a base value, don't understand that like what's necessary in order to still activate the ability for us to access this technology under the current like resources that are available would still require us to do things like be able to sacrifice particular populations, extract resources from them, and create various types of coercive financial relationships in order to make these things possible. And I think that if you have argumentation about why the kind of like bearings of like what this looks like ultimately becomes the ability to actually accelerate capitalism because of the way in which we attempt to be moving to create new positive notions of how we can revamp and reuse things like science and technology, when in actuality they're inexplicably kind of tied to foundational processes of like how these kind of like cultural images are necessary for the circulation and creation of a world where the commodification of these types of like radical futures is inevitable because of the way in which capitalism is able to operate and use them in order to fuel the next streams that people like Elon Musk and etc. are able to operationalize, even if it's not through the private sphere, because of how latent the ties between the private and public sphere are when you think about how NASA is inexplicably tied to SpaceX and these other types of examples that we've talked about through the context of just Baudrillard as a whole. Hopefully this video gives you a good idea of where you're starting with this criticism versus KTs. The next video gives you a lot more ideas of how you can use this in the context of more specific portions of the debate, and you'll continue to watch the series in order to build a better understanding of what Baudrillard looks like, space privatization, and other things that I'll be talking about on this channel. And yeah, thank you as always for tuning in.